this is Jeremy Seal, and he wrote A Fez of the Heart, which we've been focusing on this month. And let me just ask, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself for those that don't know you, haven't read much about you. Just give us a little background.
It would be a pleasure. So I'm British. I live in England. I'm 50 years old now. And when I left university, which I attended in the UK, I didn't quite know what to do with my life. So I ended up going abroad to teach English as a foreign language. And I was offered various jobs, having done a course. One of which was one of which posts was to Ankara. And I knew nothing about Turkey at the time. I was 20 years old. I had no idea where Ankara was, but I was advised by my wise father that Ankara was a good choice. So to Ankara I went in 1984. And I spent a year and a bit there teaching English, and it was love at first sight. I fell in love with the country. I travelled a great deal because I was in Ankara. I travelled to every point of Anatolia, effectively, in that year, and I adored it. And never really recovered, actually, to the point where, in my later life, when I gave up teaching and I became a writer, Turkey became my subject. And I've written about Turkey for the best part of 20 years. Magazines, and I've written books too, and that really defines me. I'm a man with a single abiding enthusiasm, which is Turkey, Turkish travel, Turkish culture, Turkish walking, Turkish food, Turkish personality, everything. Love it all. And yeah, the first book I wrote was called A Fez of the Heart, which was published in 1995, and which effectively looked at the history of the band hat, the band red hat, because I was struck how bizarre to the Western mentality, the notion of a hat being banned for political reasons is. So I pursued that as my kind of thread for this book, and it took me to all parts of the country, Cappadocia included, and that was actually the first time I went to Cappadocia, and particularly fell in love with Cappadocia as a region, and still do. I was back there late.
When was it actually that the idea of sort of centering the whole book around the Fez came to be? Was that while you were in Ankara, or was it another time, or?
It was actually after that, in 1992, as I recall. I'd been back from Ankara for the best part of 6-7 years. I'd been doing some travel writing. I'd been doing some journalism. I wanted to write a book about Turkey, and I felt that the best travel books seem to me to be the ones which have some sort of immediate and unarguable hook. Yeah. And I sort of chewed over everything that we might talk about in terms of Turkey and what the sort of associations were that most people had with the idea of Turkey. And actually somebody came up with the Fez, and I was sort of aware that there was this kind of bizarre history in the background, which I didn't know too much about. And because particularly in Britain, I know in America too, but particularly in Britain, the Fez has very, very strong kind of late colonial associations. You always sort of, you look at those films of kind of, the British Empire in Cairo, and everybody's wearing fezzes. And I had the same sort of feel about Turkey too. And then my discovery that it was kind of at the heart of, if you like, that sort of transformation, that revolutionary transformation of Turkish society from the late Ottoman to the early Republican period. And that it played a really, really pivotal role in that period. It struck me as allowing me to have a scaffolding around which I could kind of build the narrative. While at the same time doing what I wanted to do, which was travel in the old-fashioned conventional sense.
Yeah. Was it... I'm fascinated that this kind of book that you wrote, where you're sort of constantly... You're taking the reader sort of right where you are, whether it be Yozgat or Samsun or Cappadocia, and then all of a sudden the next paragraph you're transported back 100 years, and then you're giving the history and you're filling that in. Did that come naturally? Did you have to do a ton of research and sort of figure out where to say what, or how did that whole process happen?
Yeah, it's a good question. That it's something that features a lot in my writing, actually, to a much greater degree than it did in A Fez of the Heart. Yeah, it's a sort of jigsaw business, isn't it? It's to do with playing with chunks of information and trying to work out where the one sits happiest along the other. Sometimes it's easy. So when I was in Kastamonu, that was obviously the time that I was going to describe Ataturk's visit there to proclaim the fact that the Fez was gone and the Western-style hat was the future. At other times it was more difficult. It was more kind of, how does the theme here fit with the area I'm in? And actually, Yeah, it's not instinctive. It's just to do with shuffling ideas around like a jigsaw until they fit together in the best way.
Yeah. What I like about the book, and one thing that makes it easy to recommend, is that it's not as time bound in the sense that it was published 16, 17 years ago.
Yeah.
But the things you talk about are timeless in a sense, and yet there's some parts that definitely Turkey has changed quite a bit. What would if you were to come back today and write the same book? What parts do you feel like would be the biggest changes you'd have to make?
In a sense, they feel like the same old topics are there or thereabouts. I mean, certainly in terms of what appears to me is that slight schizophrenia in terms of the Turkish soul, whether it's Western or Eastern. That seems to be an ever-present theme. What certainly has changed is that sense that modern Turkey is so much more competent in terms of what it can demand and the amount of influence it has on the world stage, and just how modern it is. And that's absolutely characterized by a place like Cappadocia, which seems to me to be changing very, very rapidly. And certainly in 1984, it was a very different world. I mean, 1984 being not when I wrote the book, but when I first went to Turkey.
Right.
93 was when I wrote the book. 84 was 3 or 4 years after the coup. 93, it still felt like this was a very tentative society, a society that wasn't really clear where it was going. But from a traveler's point of view, it felt incredibly rich. I mean, everywhere I went, I had that sense that travel writers really value, of being so easily finding myself in situations that struck me as being rich and resonant and exactly the kind of material that I was after. In a way that I find difficult, it's more difficult now to do. I mean, for example, it would seem to me that it would be quite hard to do what I did with Cappadocia now, what I did 17 years ago.
Yeah.
It just feels that much more kind of keyed into the rest of the world, that much more kind of familiar and confident, and a lot of the old ways are beginning to be eroded. So you're almost seeing the end of a culture in a way that 18 years ago you definitely weren't. You were seeing a culture that was still very much intact. And that's something that I discovered on my last Turkey book, which we can talk about a bit later, that I needed to really get off the beaten track to get the same sort of level of traction in terms of the material that I wanted to get, the quality of material I wanted to get.
Yeah, it's interesting. Your initial story with down in Pomegranate with with the son and the story of the father and that whole. It's interesting. One of my good friends here in Cappadocia owns a hotel in Göreme, and he actually still lives with his father, but the difference between his world and his father's world is just still so amazingly different. It's fascinating to see, and when reading the initial story made me think more of that.
I think if you make the comparison that you've just made, it almost takes you back to other cultures and times when the two generations are split in an almost unimaginable way. It's almost like pre- and post-revolutionary Russia, or pre- or post-Civil War America. Just these times when everything seems to have changed, and all the rules have changed, and what the son or the daughter is subject to is almost unimaginable in terms of the life that the mother or father has experienced.
Yes, yeah, it's really fascinating. But I appreciated that story because they helped me to see it afresh, for sure.
Good. I'm pleased about that.
How about you in this doing the book and spending that time in Turkey, taking those trips? How do you feel like it changed you in that process of going through that, and writing that, and sort of having to see how Turkey had changed and so forth?
I think it changed me in the way that I'm a great believer that life is all about being lucky enough to find enthusiasm for yourself. I really believe that. I know lots of people who seem to have achieved in all manner of ways, but what they haven't managed to do is be lucky enough to find that enthusiasm. And I feel blessed by the fact that this is a subject I can go back to forever. I want to, and I know I will be happy and fulfilled by exploring Turkey, because it's an endlessly deep world. There's so much that I find fascinating about it. So in that way, what that book did was it kind of centered me in terms of not only my professional life, but my vocational life too. This is the subject.
Yeah, very good. I guess because that was the beginning of what has now been almost 20 years.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, as I say, I've been back travel writing, doing some radio work for the best part of 20 years. And there have been other books with big Turkish elements, like my book about St. Nicholas, who, of course, was born and lived in Demre. And the book which has been published this summer as well, which is about a trip down the Meander River, the view from Menderes, which takes us to a different part of Turkey, but it keeps me on subject.
Yes, oh, that's good. Last question here.
Sure.
So you mentioned that book. Generally, what is your life like now? What are you working on? I think where I reached you, it sounded like you were doing some kind of writer training. You're helping writers and stuff, or what are you?
Yeah, I do some of that. Yeah, I mean, every day, sometimes a day a week, 2 days a week, I help students, actually university students, who have problems in terms of framing sentences. I don't know whether you have the same problem in the States, but what seems to have happened here in England is that over the last 20 years, government educational policy has been that we don't need to formally teach kids grammar. So a lot of them, they're incredibly bright, but they can't articulate when it comes to writing down essays. So that's a different thing I do, and that's just to do with helping students improve their writing style. So I do that. I'm doing quite a lot of journalism. I'm doing some work for websites in terms of writing about Turkey and other places for websites. And I'm thinking about what I'm going to do next in terms of the next book. I don't know where that's going to be yet. I don't know whether I'll write another book immediately about Turkey, having just finished this one, having just finished this Meander book. But I will no doubt come back to this subject again at some stage.
Very good. Okay. Well, thank you so much, Jeremy, and I really appreciate you giving some time, and I really love the book, and so that's why I'm trying to get others to know about it. So thank you for your time.
Well, I appreciate you for doing that. Thank you very much indeed, and hopefully we'll meet one day in Cappadocia.